Welcome everybody to this third talk webinar. This one is going to be on core standards and particularly looking at the New Zealand-Australia deals. My name is David Bowles. I'm the chair of TAWC and I'm also the head of public affairs at the RSPCA. And obviously we are having this webinar at a very interesting time. It is now 5 months since the Australia-UK Agreement in Principle was signed, although as yet that has yet turned into a free trade agreement, and we don't have a timetable on when that will actually be offered for ratification. We also have a New Zealand Agreement in Principle, and again, we don't really have a timetable on when that's going to be offered for ratification. At the same time, we have a new Trade and Agriculture Commission that was set up a couple of weeks ago. Their job is to look at free trade agreements as they're presented to them and give an opinion on how they are going to impact on UK standards and give an independent report into Parliament. And then Parliament obviously has the job of ratifying both Australia and New Zealand free trade agreements under a process called CRAG, which is a process which doesn't, let's say, allow the greatest amount of transparency and discussion, but it does allow Parliament to put off ratifying a free trade agreement if they feel that it is not in the UK's interests. And obviously what we are hoping is that they will be looking at it from an animal welfare point of view and looking at it from a core standards point of view. So I mentioned the new Trade and Agriculture Commission. They obviously took over from the old Trade and Agriculture Commission, which gave its report in March of this year. One of the recommendations from that report was core standards, and for the UK to set up in its trade strategy core standards, which it would set against other countries' standards and make sure that the UK is not undermined by imports coming in that were produced to lower standards. And of course, one of the major issues on that will be farm standards. So I'm delighted that we have a really good panel of experts to discuss core standards and look at the differences between our standards, Australian standards and New Zealand standards. I'm going to ask each of them to just briefly introduce themselves, and then I'm going to introduce our core standards paper. So Andrew, do you want to kick off if you can be heard over the four corners?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Andrew Knight. I'm a Professor of Animal Welfare and Ethics at the University of Winchester in the UK, and I'm a New Zealand veterinary specialist in animal welfare.
Okay, and then moving south then, Glenys, you are in Australia.
Thank you, David. And yes, I'm the CEO of Animals Australia, a prominent group in Australia, but we also have an international arm, Animals International, and very interested in helping you today to understand our system here in Australia and the standards that we have, and therefore relevant to the discussion today. Thank you.
And Danielle, you are from New Zealand, but you're actually in London.
Yes, I used to run the New Zealand Animal Association. Now I'm involved with the UK Centre for Animal Law, and I also lecture animal law in New Zealand. And
finally, James, you're definitely in the UK.
Yeah, I'm the token Brit, James West, Senior Policy Manager at Compassion and Wild Farming. And
we've got a lot of good participants here, including MSPs, people from the New Zealand High Commission, from the NFU, from WWF. WWF have also put out a paper on core environmental standards, and we'll probably be having a discussion on how we merge those together. So the Trade and Animal Welfare Consortium released their core standards paper yesterday. You probably were sent copies of that, and what that is looking at is to try and give some clues to the UK government when they're developing their trade policy, and also when they're going into free trade negotiations, about what should be red lines and how to actually achieve that within the international trade rules. So you will see that we've set up a model where we have said that for certain issues that the UK should be ensuring that no products should be coming in into the UK. So for instance, obviously we've got the animal health standards, such as the beef hormone ban, the infamous chlorine chicken standard. All of those are in legislation, and that legislation says that you cannot bring those products in, and you cannot market those or sell those in the UK. That legislation would need to be changed. So those are fairly sacrosanct. Then we have the animal welfare legislation, which obviously gives baseline standards for things like laying hens, chickens, pig standards, but those do not have a trade element in it. The only trade element that is in animal welfare is on slaughter. And I'm pleased to say that for both New Zealand and Australia agreements in principle, the UK said that that they will still continue to have the previous provisions on standards in slaughter that they had when we were a member of the EU, which is that we will only bring in meat that has been slaughtered according to UK standards. Now, obviously, there is some discussion to be had as to how you define those and how you enforce those, but that's the UK's slaughter standards. Other than that, all of our legislation on animal welfare does not have trade provisions. And what TAWC is suggesting is that the UK should make it clear to other countries that we will not be lowering our standards in those areas, and we would not be expecting products to be coming in which haven't been produced to those standards. And we believe that could be defended at the WTO. We have some fairly good case law at the WTO, obviously with seals, but also with labelling provisions like tuna dolphin, which shows that you can have import bans and marketing bans based on the way that the product is produced, and you can defend those at the WTO. So we believe the UK should be fairly out there in terms of defending its standards. But also, and this is where we come into New Zealand and Australia, when we go into free trade negotiations, we should be setting out what we call conditional liberalisation, and only reducing our tariffs and only giving concessions for products which have been produced to our standards. So the question that I'm going to go round to each of our participants now is how do we look at those standards? How do we measure those standards? And what do we think we've got from the Australia and New Zealand agreement in principle? Do we think that the UK has actually upheld those standards and only given concessions where products have been produced to our standards? So let me start first of all with you, Glenys. You're based in Australia. You obviously run an Australian animal welfare NGO. You've worked with the Department of Trade there, and you've also worked with business there. How much do you feel the UK stood up to Australia on their standards and got a good deal?
Well, David, I have to say that I think it's still very unclear to me. We've not been able to get good, clear information as to what's included and what's not. What I can tell you is that I feel that that the industry here, I'm talking here primarily the farming animal industry here, and of course we do trade particularly with beef and with sheep meat and wool, for example. They're the main ones that I'd be talking about. Those my understanding from the industries here, and I don't mean specifically to do with the negotiations that have gone on, because as I say, I haven't really been able to find out very much about them. However, what I would say to you is that the industry here have been fairly adamant that they do not wish to change the standards in Australia, and I know they're lower than the UK, and they also have not indicated, really to the contrary, they're indicating that they don't believe they need to change anything because they say they have world's best standards here in Australia and they have a great tradition. So I think some of them believe that. I have to say, from working, and I've worked in this area for over 30 years, that this is not true. We have very low standards and even lower ability to enforce the minimum standards that are in place, David.
Thanks, Danielle. And you make a very good comment about interpretation of good standards. I've never known a country which has fessed up and said, yep, you're right, our standards are appalling, our farmers are not operating to good welfare standards, and therefore we're going to go with yours. And I think that's the nub of the issue. Danielle, if I can come to you, because New Zealand obviously probably has been identified as a country which, of any country in the world, has better animal welfare farm standards than the UK. And is very proud of its farm animal welfare standards, and goes into negotiations saying that animal welfare is a red line for them not to be crossed. What do you think is the reality of this, and also how do you actually judge and measure those standards?
Yes, so I think that New Zealand doesn't have the best animal welfare standards in the world, as it likes to say it does. It does have the highest standards in Australia in a number of material respects. And in general, I would say there's quite a lot of regulatory alignment between the UK and New Zealand. However, there are definitely areas where I think animal welfare issues have been very neglected. For example, animal transport. I know this is a topic for discussion that we may get into further subsequently, but for example, no transport limits except for dairy calves, which is 12 hours, which is still very long. So, and then there are a lot of issues around enforcement as well as some uses of caging, for example, enriched cages for hens. So I think there are a number of animal welfare issues, and also for broiler chickens, I should note as well, very neglected topic, very high stocking density. So I think there are still a number of outstanding animal welfare issues, and the agreement in principle effectively says, both countries have high standards of animal welfare, let's cooperate when we can, but there's no real teeth to it. There's no engagement with real standards. So it'll be good to discuss more with everyone, how do we give teeth to these broad provisions around cooperation and use it as an opportunity to lift standards up in both countries.
Yeah, and you've given a good intro. If people want to ask questions, you can either put them in the chat or say that I'd like to ask a question, and I'll then introduce you. So going on to Andrew, you're obviously a veterinarian with Australian experience, and what Danielle says is I think part of the real issue is to how do you measure these? How do you measure equivalence? And it's all very well for organisations like the RSPCA or TAWC to be saying that standards should be equivalent, but how do we actually measure those? How do we know from the animal's perspective that its life is as good living in a chicken farm in New Zealand as it would be on a chicken farm in the UK? How would you try and get around that issue?
Sure. I mean, we are well aware that there are serious animal welfare problems associated with all sorts of farming systems and species. And I think the key point here is that some of those currently occur in some countries and not in others. And we want to ensure that I think the United Kingdom standards are reflected in the free trade agreements that are established. So there are obvious areas relating to the use of conventional cages in laying hens, for example. New Zealand, I think, is planning to end those next year, which is great if that does occur. That's been ended since 2012 in the United Kingdom. The insistence on adherence to that standard for products being imported into the United Kingdom would arguably encourage New Zealand to meet the commitment that it's made to end the use of those conventional cages for laying hens. That's one example. There are other areas in which some of the most egregious animal welfare problems differ between the different nations. So the use of sow farrowing crates, for example, does still continue in the United Kingdom. But New Zealand's High Court recently decided that the continued use of those in New Zealand was contrary to the Animal Welfare Act. So the government will hopefully be producing regulations to outlaw those in New Zealand. If that occurs, then there'll be a difference in standards between New Zealand and the United Kingdom in that respect. And there are other examples as well. So, we know very clearly that some of these practices cause very poor animal welfare. The key point, I think, is which of the important ones differ between different nations, and what should we be insisting on or encouraging that be incorporated into our core standards and hence into free trade agreements.
So one of the interesting things, if you look at the difference between the Australia and the New Zealand deals, is, and of course we haven't got the final text, so we can only go what has been put on the government's websites. But one of the things that struck me was in Australia, and they're very similar in terms of the tariff reductions in beef and lamb. They're very similar in terms of how those are being phased in. But with Australia, there isn't really much in terms of equivalence language. There is a non-derogation clause, but in New Zealand it seems to go a lot further. There seems to be saying that not only can you not lower your standards, but you should make sure that you have equivalence of standards. And also, for the first time, there is some language in there on trying to measure animal welfare, looking at outputs. So, James, I'm going to come to you now because obviously the UK's legislation has mainly been on inputs. Thou shalt not have conventional battery cages for laying hens. But we have started to see over the last decade this move towards measuring outputs as well. Do you think, in your view, that this is a good way of trying to measure equivalence, or should we be sticking to the old measures of, if you don't have battery cages, then that shows equivalence, or should we be using other methods? James.
Thanks. I think I'll come to some broader points shortly, but I think on that particular question, I think in most species it's quite hard to have a clear output to indicate good welfare, whereas with certain systems there are limits to how good welfare can be. So, for example, caged farming would be an obvious one. Pig farming, for example, you might say that a pig that's not had its tail docked has had a very good quality of life if it's got all the way to slaughter without its tail being docked. But those kind of iceberg indicators, I think, are quite hard to find across all of the species, and therefore you're suddenly looking at a lot of criteria to determine the outputs, whereas the inputs are slightly clearer. Just to kind of repeat some of the things that others have already said, in terms of Australia, the farming standards there are significantly lower than the UK. World Animal Protection rank Australia in E in their Animal Protection Index, where A is the highest. Something like 40% of cattle in Australia might spend part or all of their life in feedlots, which is a system that doesn't really occur in the UK. And as you say, based on what we can find from the government's websites, it looks like the Australian deal would allow something like 60 times more beef and 4 times more lamb into the UK than currently permitted. Similarly, antibiotic use in Australia is much higher. The Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics has a report which found that in poultry, use per animal is 16 times higher than in the UK, and for pigs it's nearly 3 times higher. As others have said, battery cages banned in the UK and EU, but permitted in Australia, likewise sow stalls. And it doesn't look like the deal does anything to drive up standards in Australia or support the UK existing standards. In terms of the New Zealand, the standards there are probably closer to the UK than anywhere else outside the EU. And there are a number of areas where, as Andrew mentioned, where standards are trying to be improved. I think the key point there is, again, there's a significant amount of agricultural produce that's going to come in as part of that deal. I think with beef, it's something like a 2,400% increase. And I think more importantly, it's worth noting that the deal itself doesn't actually drive up standards. Those commitments already existed before the agreement in principle was signed.
Yeah, so that from my perspective, there's when you're looking at equivalence and core standards, there are 2 issues. One is the standards, and then you have the discussion as to how you measure those standards. And then the other issue is enforcement, and how do you enforce those standards? So I mentioned at the beginning that the UK has inherited the EU's ban on imports of meat products that haven't been slaughtered to our standards. That's been in operation now for 2 decades, never been challenged at the WTO, and the EU sends out its vets to various countries to inspect their slaughterhouses. My understanding is the UK will start to do that as well, but obviously that is a snapshot audit, and it is just on one issue, on going to slaughterhouses. And I want to come to you, Danielle, because enforcement and is obviously going to be crucial as well as the second stage for that. Are there any indicators as to how enforcement happens in New Zealand compared to the UK, and how would you try and audit and enforce standards if you actually got equivalence into free trade agreements?
Yeah, it's a really important question because enforcement is such a difficult thing to measure. In fact, even the World Animal Protection Index doesn't look at enforcement when it compares country standards because it's such a difficult thing. In New Zealand, there is an enforcement regime whereby the SPCA enforces companion animal welfare, something we inherited from the UK, and the Ministry for Primary Industries inspects farmed animal welfare, but it's very under-resourced. I think there's something like 26 inspectors for over 150 million animals, and there's no CCTV in slaughterhouses as you have in the UK as well in terms of slaughter. So I think we need to hear more from New Zealand authorities like MPI as to, what their plans are to give people confidence that their regime is properly enforced, especially given, years of criticism from animal law scholars and animal welfare organizations that there is very poor enforcement. And, we don't really know what happens on those factory farms or even at slaughterhouses. And when we do get information, it's usually from undercover activists rather than from any authorities. So I think that could be a key point of focus in terms of trying to improve things in New Zealand, or using this as an opportunity to bring standards up, is trying to get clear commitments from the New Zealand government as to how things are enforced and how the enforcement regime will be improved.
Okay, thank you. And Chris from the New Zealand High Commission has said all New Zealand slaughterhouses have cameras in their slaughterhouses, and actually abattoirs might be one of the easiest things to enforce, because as Chris says, New Zealand has mandatory CCTV, England has mandatory CCTV. Hopefully Wales will be moving towards that this year, and Scotland. And that gives you a bit more confidence in the abattoir. And as I say, at least we have that provision that meat should only be coming in if produced to our standards. So that gives you a little bit more of a confidence in the audit there. You mentioned, Danielle, about the problems of one enforcement person for so many million animals. I mean, at least you are the size of the UK, whereas Australia is, what is it, Glynis? 10 times the size of the UK, and there was a lot of discussion when we were doing the free trade agreement on Australian transport rules, which are 48 hours at the moment, compared to the UK's of 24 hours, and the UK's will probably change in the next couple of years to come down from 24 hours. So how do you do enforcement in Australia, Glynis?
I think overall we do it badly, and I don't mean that just to sorry, to denigrate the attempts that are made, but as you say, we're a very large country. We have literally 9 jurisdictions, if you like, if you count the federal government as well. Animal welfare is a state and territory, constitutionally, a state and territory requirement. And so that means that there's a different regime, although there are some similarities in each of the states and the territories. There is an attempt with farm animals to have national standards, but it's a very clunky system that, for example, when trying to review and update the cattle standards and the sheep standards, took no less than 7 years to do that. And then the state, and that leads to a meeting of all the agriculture ministers from all of the jurisdictions, and they take it up in principle. It's then up to them to take it back to their states and territories in order to put it into legislation. That can take, well, always takes a couple of years. It took over a decade for the transport standards, national transport standards, to be incorporated into Western Australia, the largest of our states, of course, and so very large distances. And so they sat with very old codes for a very long time. I say all of that because that means that talking about enforcement of standards is very difficult, perhaps not so difficult in our export abattoirs, as you've suggested, David, but even so, there are real issues there. CCTV is a reality in some of the, it's not a requirement, of course, but some of the largest abattoir processing companies, JBS and the others, have voluntarily put it in for the purposes of good management, if you like. But that's an internal thing. It's not as if it's being used for enforcement, for example. And an example of the EU's own audits that come out here every few years, it's a spot check, as you, I think, mentioned, David, but a very good example is the horse abattoir in Queensland, where the EU had done a check and thought everything was fine, only for undercover advocates to indicate the most appalling treatment and ongoing treatment in that place, leading to some changes. But again, it's not the authorities that are picking these things up. Just lastly, and I won't go on, but in regard to transport, for example, very long times and not a good system of enforcement. For example, unless you think a trip is going to be over 24 hours, there's no need, there's no requirement to actually record the last time the cattle or sheep had access to water. And so that means that they travel, and if they go to a sale yard, for example, stay overnight at a sale yard, are picked up and go on another trip, they could be literally off water for quite a few days without anybody knowing about it, because of the bad system that was put in place by those national standards. So I'll try to curtail the length of my answers, but I can say to you both the setting of standards is a very clunky and difficult situation, which is, of course, primarily influenced by the agricultural decision-making system that's in place. Agriculture ministers make final decisions, and so science and community views are not given as much weight. So we have a problem with both the level of the standards and also then their enforcement.
Thanks, Glenys. And you also raise a very interesting point, which is, of course, none of our standards are set in stone. They are dynamic, and in the UK, for instance, we have a bill going through Parliament at the moment, which will raise standards on the live transport of animals, live export of animals. When there probably will be consultations next year on standards in pig farming and laying hen farming, and that is another issue in terms of how do you take those into account as those standards evolve in core standards, and can you use free trade agreements to try and raise standards in other countries? So Chris, I'm going to come to you now. You're the person who's probably most closely involved in the trade negotiations than anyone for New Zealand. Over to you.
Yeah, so thanks, David. It was really just a point of clarification following on from Daniela's comments. Just for transparency, I used to run the veterinary service in New Zealand before coming over here. So the RSPCA in New Zealand have powers under our Act, so are warranted inspectors. They work very closely with the Ministry for Primary Industries on the farm animal side. Just in terms of enforcement, we have, yes, a number of warranted inspectors that are available for looking and checking of compliance. But what Daniela missed is the fact that we have veterinarians on all our meat plants who oversee animals coming into the premises. And if they have any concerns for animal welfare through, for example, lameness or something arriving at the establishment, they have the ability to target on-farm verification to go and understand what's happening. And of course, enforcement will follow there. We also, like the UK, have the Red Tractor equivalent scheme, farm assurance programs, and commercial programs that are monitoring animal welfare as well, and also is integrated into that system. So it's more than just compliance inspectors, it's a whole range of oversight that happens in New Zealand.
Can I just add one thing, and I guess this goes into your point, David, about comparing equivalences. I think in a lot of these discussions there, for example, on CCTV, like in the UK, there are mandatory regulations. If in this, and Glenys made this point too, some slaughterhouses might do this in Australia voluntarily, and likewise in New Zealand, but there's no equivalent, regulations. And when we compare equivalence, there's a lot of people comparing often like voluntary schemes, or even with enforcement, and Chris makes good points around vets and slaughterhouses, but there's all these different factors to take into account. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of really careful things to be considered when making these comparisons around what's actually mandatory in the law versus what a company is voluntarily doing, how many inspectors are there relative to, you know, vet process and slaughterhouses. It's just, yeah, a lot of different things to keep in mind when comparing equivalence.
Yeah, and I agree entirely with Daniela on that. But coming from the perspective is you've always got to consider the outcome of the system that's in operation. So cameras are a regulatory tool. They don't necessarily deliver the animal welfare expectations that you desire. It's the whole system in place, the quality assurance, the training, the authorizations, etc. So you've always got to step back and take a big picture perspective and not just concentrate on a standard to conclude if the animal welfare is being met.
Chris, can I push you? I know you have to be careful with your words, but the outcome indicators, but as you've raised it, the outcome indicators in the agreement in principle with New Zealand, how do you see those working? What do you think that means?
I can't comment on the details of the agreement at this stage, so we're restricted to the agreement in principle, and it's very much New Zealand and UK coming together as we always have to collaborate and advance animal welfare.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So just looking at the standards and how they change. James, I'm going to come to you. TAWC obviously in their core standards paper said that you need to take account of that when you do a free trade agreement, it's a snapshot. Standards are live; they will change. How do you feel that that negotiators should put that into the negotiation pot at the same time, knowing that standards may change in the future?
In an ideal world, the standards required in the UK, for example, would also be the standards that are required for any import to be permitted or any reduction in tariff to be permitted, and that has the benefit of offering protection to UK producers and UK standards, but also incentivizes higher welfare standards in other countries. I don't know in reality how likely countries are to sign up for that, and I think that's the problem that the UK is going to face. That pleasingly, we have a team at DEFRA who are looking to improve standards, whilst on the same hand, we're agreeing trade agreements with countries who have lower standards. Angela made a good point in the chat about it making sense for import restrictions to be a formal requirement of meeting of Australia raising their own standards. And I think that, I suspect that ship has sailed, but it would be nice if that was the case. Similarly, it would have been a good thing if the UK had agreed its core standards before it started agreeing these trade agreements. And obviously, again, it's missed that opportunity. But there are other trade agreements they're looking to sign, and in some cases, we're even bigger agricultural producers. And it would be, I think, reassuring to everyone on this call if the UK had some core standards in place before it went down those roads.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, obviously, as you rightly mentioned, is that we've got these two agreements in principle. One with New Zealand, who probably have pretty similar standards to ours. One with Australia, but they're on the other side of the world, and you won't be probably seeing any imports of egg products or chickens or pigs from those countries just because of the distances. But we are starting to do negotiations with Mexico, Canada, and India, all of which means that eggs, chickens, pigs are all in play. And as you rightly say, James, the UK does not have a position yet on core standards. And there seemed to be, when the two ministers at Trade and DEFRA gave evidence to the Trade Committee a couple of weeks ago, there seemed to be a move away from doing equivalence in FTAs. Glenys, I'm going to come to you, because do you think, is Australia up for changing its standards? And do you see FTAs as a lever mechanism to get them to change those standards? So for instance, if the UK said one of our red lines is equivalence and core standards, and we're not going to move. Do you think there would be any indication that Australia would go, okay, you are an important trading partner for us, then we will look at changing our standards?
I think so, and I hope so, of course, David, that would be the case, because, and I think someone asked sorry, I didn't see who it was, asked in the chat room about whether or not Australia is looking to improve its standards, because it's been suggested that is the case. Can I just say that I'm involved in all of the standards. They call them standards advisory groups, SAGs, and with legislative change in each of the states at the moment, there are reviews. But I have to say that I don't have a lot of confidence that there will be significant changes coming out of that. Certainly, for example, and I know that we don't export eggs to the UK or to anywhere, but what I wanted to give as an example, we are in the midst or at the end stage of a 5-year review of the poultry standards. Now, clearly that's across meat, chickens and turkeys and all sorts. But just to speak about layer hens, we don't have a phase out of the cages at this stage. We failed to do that in 2000. And so now we're reviewing it again, and we're at the pointy end of it. And the likelihood is a recommendation of a phase out by about 10 to 15 years. In that, we Animals Australia certainly want it to be shorter than that, but the industry want it to be 2046 before the end of battery cages, and they are pressing for that, and remembering that, as I said before, it's agriculture ministers that will make this decision. And similarly, for example, in Victoria, we're having a review of our Animal Welfare Act, and the industry here, the farming industry, are pressing back, for example, even mentioning the word sentient in the new Animal Care and Protection Act. They don't want that word used, and they don't want any changes at all to the current standards. Now, I'm seeing that reflected in each of the forums that I'm working in across the states and at the federal level on other issues. So I don't have any confidence, David.
Okay, and Andrew, you're a professor of animal welfare at Winchester. What indications do you get in terms of countries moving their standards? Is it only the UK, and to an extent the EU has also given indications that they may well be phasing out cages as well? What sort of sense do you get what's happening globally?
I mean, I certainly am aware of other nations that are interested in the cage-free movement. Bans seem to be occurring in various other nations around the world and in certain farming systems. I haven't sort of sat down and systematically reviewed that. So it was concerning to hear what Glenys just said about the pushback against the inclusion of the word sentience and any reforms in general in Victoria. I think she mentioned the inclusion of sentience within animal welfare acts is something that is happening in a number of nations around the world. So I'd simply comment that I think the reluctance of the Australians in that respect is out of step with the progress that seems to be occurring internationally. Okay,
so we also have all as rightly mentioned, the labelling consultation, which finishes in 2 weeks' time, and it's call for evidence, so it's not a consultation. DEFRA are trying to amass all the evidence they can as to looking at mandatory labelling. What should it be? On what products should it be? And at what stages? Should it just be retailers? Should it be processed products? Should it be even restaurants? James, how much do you think labelling is a solution in this sort of toolbox versus free trade agreements, and how much should we be relying on labelling versus what we're actually negotiating in free trade agreements?
So generally speaking, we support method of production labelling. If you look at egg production, when the labelling came in there, the free range sales in the UK was something like 30%, I think that was 2004, 2006, and now they're 65, 67%. So, informing consumers about what they're buying can help drive up purchases of higher welfare products. And obviously, if the UK introduces that scheme more broadly, they should be introducing it for imported goods as well as for domestically produced goods. I think the problem in that is you have already accepted that those products are coming in if you're going to label them. So you've not stopped the import of the low welfare goods. You've simply allowed consumers to know that they're buying it. Obviously, we'd want the imports to be restricted or at least subject to significant tariffs, and the labels to be applied to all goods, but for it to, ideally, the bottom label would be for kind of the lowest standard that exists in the UK, not some lowest standard that exists somewhere outside the UK.
So in other words, labelling is good, mandatory labelling is good, but it's a bit of a backstop. You really need, it's your free trade agreements that are the most important thing to get your equivalence and your core standards in there. I'm gonna come to Glenys and Danielle for how's labelling in Australia and New Zealand? What sort of is the UK, obviously the UK only has mandatory method of production labelling on eggs, has had it since 2004, also has it on fish. But we don't have it on any other products at the moment. What's the situation in Australia, Glenys?
Oh, it's fairly patchy in Australia. The commercial labelling, of course, there are attempts at that. There's been significant commercial law challenges in regard to the word free range, and certainly in regard to the poultry industry, meaning the meat chicken industry, and free range egg industry as well. That led to requirements to decide when you could use the word free range on egg cartons, for example, and where they landed was that as long as there was a maximum of 10,000 birds per hectare outside, that is the density outside, then they could say they were free range. And that's a national standard, not to do with animal welfare standards, but rather a commercial customer type standard. But there's the labelling is very patchy, and some of the claims and labels that have got through, we've actually thought that they are quite misleading. So I would say we're not very good at giving consumers a good understanding of what is meant by various claims about free range, or in fact, case of pork, for example, sow stall free, and sow stall free in Australia means still that they could be in a gestation crate, a sow stall, for up to about 10 days of their pregnancy, and then go into a farrowing crate, which are quite legal as well. And so the concern is that people think that the meat they're buying that's called sow stall free is a much better system than what they're actually getting.
And Danielle, I know you're based in London at the moment, but what's the situation in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think this is an area that's very ripe for reform in New Zealand. I think probably there'd be a lot of support from at least certain New Zealand industries to support better animal welfare labelling, for example, because farrowing crates have been banned and will be banned by 2025. And, there'll still be imports coming in of pork produced. I think maybe 40%, or it's quite a high percentage of imported pork coming in. That's probably going to mostly be from countries that use farrowing crates. So I think it's something that, I'd like to see more collaboration between industry and advocates in New Zealand on that particular point. But even around eggs, there's still major issues. There've been, a number of prosecutions in recent years over like false labeling of eggs, because it's just not a very robust regime. A lot of people buying farm fresh eggs that are, of course, from conventional cages, which are not banned until next year, and even then enriched cages will be used. So I think it's an area, yeah, really ripe for reform. And in fact, even just a few years ago, there was controversy around pork labelling because there was New Zealand pork used a certain label to suggest it was like a pig safe branding, and the New Zealand Commerce Commission wrote to them and said this is misleading basically, and they adjusted it. But I think, yeah, there's just a lot of scope for reform, and hopefully on certain issues at least, I'd hope that, you know, industry and advocates might be aligned.
Yeah, and as John's put in the chat, one of the key things is probably assurance schemes, farm assurance schemes, red tractor, RSPCA assured are much more developed in the UK than New Zealand or Australia. Although to be fair to Australia, you've got a much higher percentage under the RSPCA scheme on chickens than we do have in the UK on chickens. But obviously assurance schemes are only as good as the auditing of those, as well as the standards. And if you're having those on imports as well, it all comes back to auditing and how robust is your audit mechanism. So I'm now going to come to Kat, Mark, and Tim. Kat, you're the chief policy advisor for the NFU on animal health and welfare. Where do you think? I mean, and obviously the RSPCA and animal welfare groups have worked very closely with the NFU. We've had exactly the same position in terms of ensuring products do not come in unless to our standards. Where do you think the government can go on this?
Well, I have to say, David, first of all, congratulations on a really interesting session. It's been really good, and you know, as I say, it is really interesting. The one point that I wanted to come across on, though, was the conversation we just had around welfare labelling. I didn't want it to be implied. You said quite a kind of a broad statement that mandatory labelling was good. And I didn't want any surprises. The NFU's position, we're still forming our position in terms of the call for evidence, but our position is that mandatory labelling would not be good. It could bring in huge confusion for consumers. It could actually go against some of the animal welfare improvements. So I just wanted to make that clear, that I think your statement, which I know was probably just a kind of a benefit of commentary, was a little bit too broad brush and simplistic. So I just wanted it clear that the NFU was not sharing that position. I think, to be honest, I think the idea of core standards is something that I think would be very hard to disagree with as a principle. As you say, David, we have agreed in the past quite strongly around some of the principles of equivalence and trade standards. There are a few things that we would probably want to kind of go away and actually kind of look into in some detail, you know, but I think kind of, yeah, it's been really good. And I think, as I say, largely in the principles, I think you know, there's an awful lot that we would share in terms of agreement. But as I say, it was a welfare labelling that we definitely don't.
Okay, yeah, no, it's always good to have. If the RSPCA agreed with the NFU on everything, I'd probably be drummed out as well as the RSPCA. Mark, you and I go back many decades, if I can say that to you, to when the battery hen ban was first brought in 1999. And how worried are you about these negotiations with India, Mexico, Canada on eggs? And where do you think core standards should be in that discussion?
The answer is yes, David, we do go back a long way, and I think our grey hair rather illustrates that. But anyway, no, thanks for this. As Kat says, very interesting discussion this morning. Just a few points, and then I'll come to answer your question, David. Yes, we are worried, but as things sit at the moment, of course, we have fairly good tariff protection. Okay, shell eggs tend to be consumed close to the marketplace because obviously the vast majority of an egg is liquid, and it costs an awful lot of money to move liquid around the world. So therefore, and when I say close to the marketplace, I effectively mean, you know, in individual countries. So the Brits like British eggs, the French like French eggs, and so on. Our greatest threat, of course, are on egg products, particularly dried egg products. So you take the water out of an egg and you can ship it around the world at next to no price whatsoever. Now, You're right, David, and with James as well, your organisation. We've done a tripartite letters on more than one occasion to government in support of a common wish, and that is to maintain our high standards of animal welfare here in the UK and not have them undercut by imports. James, just to correct, if I may, a figure, you quoted the huge increase in free range over the last few years, and it is a huge increase, but free range in terms of overall egg sales is a 58%, okay, cage is 37%, but at retail it's nearer 70% now, free range sales are, which is a huge success story. Why is it like that? Very clear, because we clearly label on the egg packs exactly what consumers can see on the shelf, and they make that informed choice. Now, the problem we have is retail sales are only 60% of all eggs which are sold. 20% go to food service, which, as you all know, is very price sensitive, and the other 20% will go to be processed. And it's that 40% where we're particularly concerned about, because if I'm being honest, a lot of the food buyers, in the big food manufacturers, they're under so much pressure from retailers to keep costs down that they would wish to source, from, well, a very competitively priced product. Let's be diplomatic about it. So that's where we see our greatest threat. So it's dried egg products, and it's particularly on the invisible sectors there. I think it's also worth noting that, and Marissa, you and I were discussing this with my colleague a couple of weeks ago, and that is that people say, well, of course, don't worry, British Lion eggs are sold in British supermarkets. Yes, they are. That's absolutely fine at the moment. The problem we face in the future, if there's going to be free trade agreements, and David, you mentioned India and some of the, the Pacific Rim countries. Well, let's remember Mexico also has an Atlantic seaboard as well, and they are very, very large producers of eggs. Okay, in fact, they consume the most eggs in the world per capita. When I was working in Europe, the European Commission, of course, had or the EU, I should say, had an association agreement with the Mexicans, which of course was renegotiated not that long ago. The Mexicans wanted more quota, which of course they got. But the problem we face from them particularly is, again, not shell eggs, it's going to be egg products. And they're still using battery cages. Most of their industry is battery cages. We've moved on from that, and now we have our government, obviously driven by certain, members sitting around this table today, who would obviously wish our enriched cages to be prohibited as well. Well, that's all fine and good, but we mustn't leave our back door open. So we have said very clearly to the Minister, if you want to stop the use of enriched cages in the UK, you have to ban all imports of eggs and egg products from said systems the day after, because otherwise the effect of, or the knock-on effect to all egg producers, whether you're organic, free range, barn or whatever, is going to be immense. Because the egg processing plants in this country, which take the second quality eggs from all different types of egg producers, wouldn't be able to compete with these imports coming in from Mexico or whatever. So therefore they would become traders only, they would no longer process, and all of a sudden every single egg producer in this country would not have an outlet for their second quality eggs. So that then becomes an actual cost of disposal rather than actually a revenue stream. So thank you, David.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I think eggs are going to be one of the real touch point issues, and I was really interested yesterday. There was a really technical piece of legislation called the Egg Marketing England Regulations, and this got passed by consensus between the opposition and the government. But the minister made a very interesting comment. She used the word equivalence on egg standards in that discussion, and I think that was really an interesting way forward. Tim, I'm going to come to you for the last comment.
Well, that's good timing, David, because I have got a comment. So I'm going to make 3 short comments. The person who led our vaccine program here in the UK has just published an article and given a speech which says that civil servants are not good at innovation or outcomes. And to direct translation to our ANZAC colleagues, that means bloody useless. The second thing is that if I ever took credit for anything, it might have been for bringing Peter Stevenson in Compassion and World Farming into DEFRA and into Parliament for APGOR, our all-party group on animal welfare, for challenging 5 years ago that you could do something about welfare and trade standards. And in fairness to the British government, that is now accepted dogma, you can do something. What I've heard today, and this is my advice from some old boy, is that there's lots of options and lots of ideas, but you aren't giving these British officials a clear roadmap, a consensus, something they can take forward. You've given them lots of options to divide and conquer. And our Chancellor, who, going back to the COVID example, talked about the plans to support employment during the COVID outbreak, said, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. A clear plan that most people can get ahead of most of the time would force both politicians, but more importantly, officials who start to look at this policy to actually make some replies. Because at the moment, I would, if I was in their seat, and I have been, I would just play you all off against each other to do nothing. So I'm sorry to be sort of a bit blunt. It's really interesting what's happening, but actually I think that's something that the Trade and Animal Welfare Commission could focus on. And in particular, as a final point, if any country has done anything near this as a precedent, that's what civil service love, because they don't have to think of a new idea. Sorry to be cynical, but it's a really important subject. How do we take it forward? Outcomes.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Tim, and I think that's a really good and important point to end on, because this is the beginning of the discussion, not the end. I think you're absolutely right that we need much more discussion amongst ourselves on this issue, how to present that to the UK government. The talk coming together with the farming industry, with the veterinarian organisations, with the producers, to have an agreed position. And let's forget that we're talking about animal welfare. Environment is an important point as well, and there are crossovers. The deforestation point in Australia to clear land for beef farming was discussed under the Australia trade agreements, and I look forward to working with the environmentalists on seeing where we can have crossover and agreements on their core standards report. So I'd like to end this webinar now by thanking in particular our speakers, Danielle, Glenys, Andrew, and James. Thank you very much for all your contributions. Also to the other people that have spoken or put stuff into the chat. As I said, this is the beginning of a discussion on this. TAWC released their core standards paper yesterday. That is a discussion paper, and we really want people to feed back on that. So please do feed back on that to either myself or Marissa. And we look forward as we start to get more details on the Australia and New Zealand agreements, and they turn into free trade agreements, and the TAC produce their report on this, and politicians discuss it, and obviously need more evidence. This is a really live, interesting time to be discussing this. So thank you very much indeed to everybody for getting up early and coming on here. Marissa, as normal, thank you very much for all your help in producing this. And we had our normal discussion about, we're not going to have much discussion on this. Everyone's going to be very bored, and there'll be lots of empty spaces. So I'm very pleased to say that we haven't had any empty spaces at all. Thank you very much for your rich discussion, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.